Democratic Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi is live with us this evening. Congressman, thank you for taking a few minutes. We appreciate it. Let me just get your reading of, you heard the president immediately after these shootings, the Dayton and El Paso episodes. The suggestion certainly seemed to be out there that he might be in line with background checks. You see this new statement. What do you make of it? What do you make of his position right now?
I don't know. I don't think we really know what his real position is. But we know what my voters and my constituents and most Americans believe, which is we need, for instance, universal background checks now. And the support is just off the charts. It's nearly universal. And, as a parent of 3 kids, I think, one of the tensest moments that you can get these days is one of those alerts on your phone that, there's been a mass shooting in your area because you fear it's your school. And now we see bulletproof backpacks sales skyrocketing. That's just not a place where we want to go.
The last time there was a move, I think a concerted move toward background check legislation back in 2013 in the wake of the Sandy Hook massacre, it did not make it through the Senate. Needed a certain number of votes. There wasn't able to get it. One of the criticisms of that effort, that was the Manchin-Toomey effort back in 2013, was that potentially there were too many loopholes in that if it had been enacted. Would that criticism apply to what Democrats are trying to do right now to get something through? Would it require leaving some loopholes in place? What would a background check law that Democrats authored look like?
Well, the background check bill that passed out of the House on a big vote is called H.R. 8. And basically what it would do is extend background checks from not only current commercially, federally licensed firearms dealers, but also to gun shows, internet sales, and private sales. And so it basically closes a lot of loopholes in the sense that, if you were to purchase a weapon over the internet or at a gun show, you would not be subject to those background checks. So those are the major loopholes this closes.
We mentioned Chuck Schumer a minute ago, the Democratic leader in the Senate. He is basically saying now that from his standpoint, Democrats in the Senate will not sign off on this so-called red flag law, any kind of red flag legislative effort, without the Senate also taking action on the background check bill that you're talking about there that the Democrats passed out of the House. Does the flip side of that apply to you in the House? Is a red flag law a no-go unless the Senate does something on background checks?
I think the red flag law could be a component of a package of bills, but I think that an essential component would have to be these universal background checks. I got to tell you, among my constituents, this bill is just incredibly popular, and people want it now. They want something now, and this is substantial, and it needs to be done now.
I guess we mentioned 2013 when background checks got a vote there in the Senate, didn't get through. I remember covering that at the time. The polls looked the same, about 90% support among all Americans. I mentioned it was just in the wake of that terrible Sandy Hook massacre, and there were all sorts of predictions that anybody who had blocked background checks back then in defiance of 90% of the country would pay a price in 2014. In 2014, in the midterm elections that year, Republicans made major gains, and the folks who voted to stop background checks did not get voted out of office. Is there a reason why this hasn't translated into a political backlash before, and why would it be different now?
Well, unfortunately, the reality is that there's just been a lot more mass shootings since then. And not only have there been more mass shootings, but now we have this toxic mixture of, for instance, domestic terrorist groups possessing, weapons of mass violence, these firearms. And then you have El Paso and similar episodes. And so I do think that perhaps, more people are reconsidering this issue than even before. And, just for instance, a Quinnipiac poll I just saw showed that 97% of gun owners now want universal background checks. So you have to ask why, universal background checks aren't being passed. And people ask that question. And it appears to be that, gun companies want to sell more guns. And that's the reason. And their representative, the NRA, is pushing opposition to this bill.
Democrats control the House, Republicans the Senate. Presidential election is heating up. Dozens, scores of your colleagues are calling for impeaching this president. Realistically, by the end of this fall, do you think there will be gun control legislation that makes it through Congress and is enacted into law?
If it's going to happen, I think it probably would happen in September. And I think that it's going to partly depend on where the president stands. Unfortunately, a lot of my Republican colleagues in the Senate and in the House, but especially the senators, are waiting for the president to provide them cover, and they don't want to be primaried or worse, attacked by the president. And so I think that that's probably going to decide whether or not this bill goes, the universal background checks bill, goes anywhere in the Senate.
All right, Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi.